I'm standing in the middle of the Canadian department store, The Bay, which admittedly is a strange place to open the episode. But this is a strange and unusual story that involves Canada's oldest business, the Hudson's Bay Company. Pierre Radisson was an explorer, salesman, pirate, murderer, cannibal, and a co-founder of the Hudson's Bay Company. That is, before it was stolen out from under him, just as the pieces began to fall into place. We are joined by author and historian Mark Bourrie as we examine the very dangerous life and almost unbelievable times of Pierre Esprit Radisson. Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and I really appreciate you joining us for today's show. Hold tight, everyone. We're about to travel 400 years into the past, long before Canada or the US existed, when the continent was ruled by the brute forces of nature, and several civilizations fought it out for survival and for supremacy. But before we get to that, if you live in or are going to be visiting Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto, we would absolutely love to see you out on tour. We have some great stories we would like to share with you. This past week, we put up our tickets for our Haunted Walk experience at Black Creek Pioneer Village. They have gone up for sale, and that's easily one of our best tours. And while we can never guarantee paranormal activity on a tour, that tour does seem to have more than its fair share. And that experience is going to be running throughout the summer and, of course, into the fall, with the big conclusion around Halloween. For information about any of our tours, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. If you enjoy our tours and these episodes, you could easily do us a little favor by simply mentioning the show or our tours to someone you know. Mark Bourrie is a Canadian lawyer, journalist, best-selling author, historian, and university lecturer. He joins us live in our Ottawa studio to talk about his new book, Bushrunner, The Adventures of Pierre Esprit Radisson, murderer, salesman, pirate, adventurer, cannibal, and co-founder of the Hudson's Bay Company. Mark, thanks so much for joining us on Haunted Talks.
It's great to see you.
Now, the story of Radisson's life that you unfold in the book is almost unbelievable. And not because your research is in any way suspect, but rather because his life, the death-defying adventures he had, the people he met, the wonders he saw, the historical events that he was a part of or witness to seem extraordinary. In some ways, it kind of reminded me of the movie Forrest Gump, where a combination of dumb luck and ambition gave him a ringside seat to some of the most important events, that one person could witness. Now, before we get into the details of his incredible life, I'm curious what it is about his story that captured enough of your interest and your imagination to write a book about it.
It is the Forrest Gump element, and it was what spurred me to create the proposal in the first place to write the book. I had looked him up for some reason, and I can't for the life of me remember why. And when I did, I realized he had been in all these places at times when things were happening. So I looked him up, I guess probably for something to do with the Hudson Bay Company in about 2004, and saw that he had been in London in 1666. And that's when the Great Fire was. And then I looked some more, and he had been there the year before, and that was when the Great Plague had hit. And, well, that's odd. And then I did a little more digging, and I found he had been on an expedition with the French Navy and a bunch of pirates in the Caribbean, and had been stranded on a rock during one of the great French maritime disasters of France's military history. Nothing else had happened like that in generations. So I thought, well, boy, who has he met? And I came across these incredible larger-than-life characters that sort of popped out of history in the middle of the 1600s at the end of the religious wars. People like Prince Rupert, who had been in his 20s a general and who'd been an inventor, who was sort of like a mad scientist, really, who could have been King of England if things had worked out well for him. And Charles II and Louis XIV and people that he'd met in Canada who were founders of this country, and thought, well, boy, there's a great story there. Now, is there any part where the story falls down? Does it sort of peter out, or is there a big gap in the middle? And as I put together a timeline of his life, I realized that he had just always been in the middle of really interesting things. So I put together a book proposal in 2004, and later was asked to write the book.
And it's interesting in your introduction, despite the fact he has some very an unscrupulous side to him, to say the least, it seems like you have some admiration for him, though.
I think he was a lot of fun, by and large. I mean, I wouldn't really trust him with anything, certainly not with money or anything. But he is a real character who's got lots of guts. He doesn't have any problem with getting into situations that most of us would think would be better dodged. He has the internal courage to cross the ocean 10 times at a time when it was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And he's always looking for some sort of angle, some sort of way of getting rich, in an almost comical way. And he keeps setting himself up in these incredible jackpots. Like he elopes with the daughter of a pirate, a member of one of the most vicious families in England. He hooks up with Mohawk warriors at one point and goes on a raid into the Ohio Valley, just like a handful of these guys, basically heading out to kidnap and kill anybody they came across. He goes out to what's now the American Midwest and makes huge promises to the Cree and the Sioux about how he's going to personally protect them from all their enemies, and throws a few bells and beads and axes and swords around to people as gifts, and cons them into believing that he can actually do this, and they load him up with a king's ransom in furs. We can sort of psychoanalyze him. Maybe he's a sociopath, and probably is, but I just like his nerve. I found him quite funny. When I did the research, a lot of the research was reading what he wrote, and I liked the way he wrote, and I liked the way he explained things, and how he didn't try to hide himself when he wrote.
Well, let's go back maybe not right to the beginning, but certainly where the book begins, which is as a young man, Radisson leaves France and travels across the ocean, settles in New France, present-day Quebec for American listeners, in 1651.
And he's 14.
But he's not there very long before he has a very life-changing event that really sets the stage maybe for everything that happens throughout the rest of his life.
Yeah, when you read the first few pages of the book, you realize that this is not a normal story of that period. Normal story of that period is people who get kidnapped by indigenous people, by Mohawk warriors. Don't have anything good to say about the Mohawks if they live. Most of them don't survive it. Most of the Europeans who are grabbed by the Mohawk warriors who are doing raids in Eastern North America don't live. And Radisson gets kidnapped by these guys who surround him as he's hunting ducks, and surround him in tall grass and just sort of all rise above the grass and just look at him. And of course, being Radisson, he fights. He takes a shot at one guy and he goes down swinging, and they grab him and they tie him up and they put him in a canoe. And at this point, you're thinking, well, this is going to end badly. But after a little while, he starts cooking for them. He starts paddling with them. He starts learning their language. He says in his own writings, I wanted to see their country. And so off he goes. And he just pretends that he's not in danger, and he sails right through it. He gets adopted by one of the richest families in the Iroquois country, people who shower him with clothes, stuff that they've had to buy from the Dutch traders nearby, shower him with weapons and attention and affection, with wampum, which is an incredibly valuable commodity at the time. And he lives the life of an Iroquois prince for 2 years.
And during this time with the Iroquois, He not only learns the social customs, the languages, but he also, which he uses to great effect, obviously, later in his life, but he also demonstrates a taste for violence and flesh, quite literally. Could you share a little bit about that side of Radisson and kind of the life he led with the Iroquois at that time?
Well, he's obviously very tough and quite ornery. And he's with young Iroquois men who are out to prove themselves as warriors. And he signs on to that without any hesitation. And off they go into what's now Ohio and Indiana. And at one point, they run out of food and they eat one of their prisoners. And he seems to have no qualms about that. And why do we know he did that? Because he wrote a piece for King Charles II of England in which he talks about it. It says we went to this village, we grabbed these people, we went down this river in a canoe, and when we ran out of food, we ate a woman. And yeah, that's Radisson. There's just nothing that he shows any scruples about. He doesn't condemn the Iroquois for what they do. It's all part of the game. And one of the really interesting things about Radisson, which makes him far, far different from anybody writing at that time, or for maybe the next 150 years, is that he doesn't make value judgments against any of the people he ever writes about. It's a really odd thing. I've read an awful lot of the literature of this period. So I've read the Jesuit Relations, which are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words written by French priests in North America from the 1630s to the early 1700s. And they've got nothing good to say about the culture and the lives of the indigenous people. But Radisson does. Radisson's just fine. And he would have lived with them forever if events hadn't intervened.
Now, we say that on the one hand, but as we move through the chronology, we know he's about to kind of betray the Iroquois, the Mohawk, who took him in there and, as you say, showered him with gifts, affection, attention, all of these things. Could you work out for us how, he ends up betraying his adoptive family in this case and eventually heads back to Trois-Rivières in New France to kind of set up operations? How does he get from there back to kind of quote-unquote civilization?
This is probably one of his more benign betrayals because he abandoned his family, the Iroquois family who adopted him. So he's about 16 at this point, and he visits the Dutch trading post at Fort Orange, which is where Albany, New York is now, in disguise as an Iroquois. And one of the guards at this trading post is a French soldier working for the Dutch, and he says to Radisson in French, which throws Radisson for a loop, are you a French guy? And Radisson's like, no. And then they get talking, and Radisson lets out, yes, I am French. And the guard scares Radisson by saying, well, you can live like this now, but one of these days, and I think it's going to happen fairly soon, the French are going to invade the Iroquois country, and if they get you alive, you're a dead man. You'll pay the price for treason. This scares Radisson. He thinks about it for a couple of weeks, and then he decides that he's going to take off. So he goes to Fort Orange. He defects to the Dutch. The Dutch ship him down to Manhattan, which is just a village of about 2,000 people, where he spends some time, and he writes about life in very early New York before he gets a boat to Holland. Then he goes to France. Then he goes back across the ocean to Trois-Rivières. When he gets back, he finds out that there's peace between the French and the Iroquois, that he could have stayed put, at least for quite a while. And he begins working on other projects involving the fur trade. And then he goes back to the Iroquois country, and on the way, he meets Iroquois people who know his family. He doesn't meet anybody from his former family, but they know him, and they're, how you doing? Well, fine. Here's some presents for my mom and dad, and he gives these Iroquois that he runs into a bunch of stuff to give to his mom and dad and his adoptive sisters. There's really no hard feelings, and he spends some more time in another part of the Iroquois country before going back to Trois-Rivières and then making his big trip out west.
And that big trip, I think, was in 1658, where Radisson and his brother-in-law, Medard de Grossier, began an epic journey which took them up the Ottawa River, along the north shore of Lake Huron, the south shore of Lake Superior, in present-day Wisconsin, in Minnesota, which is a huge geographical distance to cover by canoe and by foot, essentially.
Especially when people are trying to kill you along the way.
Well, yeah, obviously. And, one of the most fascinating parts I found about your book was his descriptions of kind of the natural wonders that they passed. Obviously, comparing that to current day, I wonder if you could share, some of those passages that you found most interesting of his, just descriptions of the scenery.
Yeah, one of the areas that he describes is the area where I live, which is the Ottawa Valley, and especially the city of Ottawa. He spends a few days in this part of the world. There's a falls here called Rideau Falls, and Rideau is French for curtain, and it's actually a double falls, and it's the Rideau River flowing over a cliff. And there's a space, or at least there was, behind the waterfall where you could actually walk through. And Champlain did it, and so did Radisson. He also camped right across from where the Canadian Parliament buildings are now. And he describes little islands and things that you can still see if you live in the Ottawa area, if you're driving along the Ottawa River or on a boat in the Ottawa River. When he gets up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, he really likes it there. And he does a lot of description of the South Shore of Superior. He was very enamored. I suppose the Michigan Tourist Association should go and look at Radisson's writings about the picture rocks and the beaches and the dunes of the Michigan Shore of Superior, because he thought that was the best place in the world when he was there. And then he eventually ends up on Western Lake Superior, sort of in the Duluth area, Duluth, Minnesota area, living with refugee Indigenous people, refugee Native people who have been driven out of southern Ontario and driven out of parts of what's now southern Michigan and are living in the north and are just getting by. And he has some pretty tough times with them. Not that they didn't like him, it's just that he just became another mouth to feed, and they had a very hard time looking after themselves. So he sees the other side of the coin. He's seen the rich Iroquois society, and now he's seeing the fallout of these wars that have been happening, that the Iroquois have been winning, and all these other smaller First Nations or tribes, whatever you want to call them, have been losing.
And it was interesting. I found there was quite a contrast between when he writes about the wildlife, the amount of fish in a location, or even bison is mentioned, but like kind of the abundance of the land. But at the same time, that winter when he's on this trip, I mean, they almost die, all of them,
Yeah,
because the conditions are just so harsh.
yeah, they're on the South Shore of Superior. It's a very snowy winter, very cold winter. The Indigenous people have split up, and the snow is so deep that they can't hunt anymore, and they haven't got enough food that they've grown to get through the winter. So a lot of them starve, and it's only because the Sioux arrive and then spring arrives soon afterwards that these people live through it. I would say Radisson maybe had a week or two left before he was going to die. They were so hungry that they were eating anything that was organic, scraping the inside of the bark off trees, boiling up furs. At one point, they're boiling up the furs that Radisson had trapped for anything to get their hands on. He ends up killing a dog at one point, a pet that belongs to somebody else, and feeding half a dozen people with this dog, and then going back and collecting the snow where the dog bled out to make soup out of that. That's how desperate they were. This is the point in his life where he came closest to dying on one of his expeditions.
And he did have several close calls throughout his life. I'm sure we'll get to some more of those. But that trip also really was his biggest windfall in the end, or maybe where he was best positioned to be a success in business in the development of the Hudson's Bay Company. How successful was that trip? How were they able to accumulate so much fur at the same time being in such dire straits?
The First Nations in that part of the country are trying to make an alliance with the French, a military and a trade alliance, and loaded these two clowns up with as much fur as they could, because that was the way that these promises were cemented. There was the Cree were also trading with the French for the first time, so there was their chance to get guns and axes, which they really wanted for hunting and for warfare. The Indigenous people out there were undervaluing their furs somewhat, so I think that helped Radisson and Groseilliers quite a bit. So it all came together in the spring of that they left with a big feast and a big send off. It's not just the furs that they are able to finagle, it's the labor. And when you read about how many people it took to lug all these furs, they had to lug all these furs down the Ottawa River for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, over portages, around rapids. They had to They had to paddle across wide open water where it was dangerous, and it wasn't just these two French guys carrying all these furs. They got probably maybe 50, 100 indigenous people all working basically for free to transport the stuff to Montreal, where only Radisson and Groseilliers really profit from it.
And that labor and the goodwill, the network they were able to develop was based completely on false promises. They were the promise of more guns and weapons when they had no other weapons they could give them. The idea that the French would come and protect them of some sort. I mean, all of it was just stuff Radisson was making up to grease the deal, essentially.
Right, and when they're about a day and a half outside of Montreal, as they're coming down the Ottawa River, they see body parts hanging from trees. And this is actually the remains, literally, of a French expedition that had gone up to fight the Iroquois and had been wiped out, the Adam Dollard expedition. And Radisson and Groseilliers, they realize when they see this that they're not going to get back up that river again. And they're going to have to find another way to get to these furs. And the Hudson Bay idea is the other way. It's basically a simple thing of doing an end run around all of the people who are blocking that trade.
And so they have the idea for the company. As you said, they run into all these obstacles. And so what steps do they try to take to overcome them? And it's not to give anything away, but they have a lot of trouble getting this idea off the ground.
Yeah, well, the first time they're going to do it, it's very simple. They're just going to do it. They decide to go down to the East Coast. This is when they're still with the French and get a boat and sail to Hudson Bay. But a Jesuit pops up, and Jesuits sort of pop up in this story in the weirdest place. So this priest pops up and says, "Don't you do it," and says to Radisson, "You stay away from that brother-in-law of yours. He's a sleaze." And Groseilliers is a foil for Radisson is this sort of ambitious, bright person with a genius for languages, and Groseilliers is a grump. And Groseilliers is the guy that everybody thinks you cannot trust. And when they decide to go to Hudson Bay, they're fairly close to pulling that off. They've got the money and everything, but it just doesn't happen because of the warnings that they got. So then they spend some time in what's now Nova Scotia, and everybody chases them out. They're just a couple of freeloaders. And then they end up in Boston. And when they're in Boston, they run into some very important English people who just happen to be there on some business, who cart them off to Europe. But of course, it's never simple for Radisson. You can't just sail from Boston to England because that would be too normal. They get caught by pirates off the coast of Spain. And they have to throw all their papers and everything that's sort of incriminating into the ocean while they're fighting off the pirates with cannon fire. But of course, they know they're going to be taken. And they basically play dumb. And the Dutch pirates plunk them on the Spanish coast, which you would think is not a good thing. But it is a good thing, because when they get from Spain, on how they came up with the money to get from Spain to England, I don't know. And this is Radisson and Groseilliers and a bunch of other people. They show up at the end of the Great Plague of 1665. So if they'd sailed to London, if they had arrived on time, they almost certainly would have died of the plague. So this is one of these things where Radisson turns lemons into lemonade. He's very good at this. He has this kind of luck.
And as they arrive in England, it seems they're almost treated as kind of quasi-celebrities. I would say like a B-list celebrity today. And they do acquire a little bit of influence in the court there.
Well, people love adventure stories back then because this was a time of adventure. There had been a civil war in England, and almost everybody in power had gone through the Civil War and come out as some sort of dashing Three Musketeers type. The king was like that. Prince Rupert had, like I said, had been a general in his early 20s. The Duke of Albemarle had led an army that had put the king back in power, and he was one of Radisson's sponsors. Everybody lived a life of action. That was part of what a well-rounded man was like back then. So you dressed like the Three Musketeers. You engage in piracy if you have to. Prince Rupert had been a pirate. His brother Maurice had actually been washed off a pirate ship during the English Civil War. They had been on the losing side, and they had to find some way to make a living, so they turned pirate. That was the kind of people that ran England at the time, not the sort of stuffy aristocrats that we think of now, the landed aristocracy. These were not people like that at all. So a guy like Radisson, who's got all these stories of adventure, and who can literally write down "I was a cannibal" a few times, and give that to the king, and the king is cool with that and gives him a gold chain and a picture and sets him up with his business buddies. That's the times, and it reminds us that people have changed quite a bit. Our culture has changed quite a bit.
And were the French and English at odds at that particular point? Because obviously he would be a traitor to the French at this point, or?
It's a tricky thing. The English king was the first cousin of the King of France and was actually secretly taking bribes from him. So what we think of as national loyalties didn't exist in that kind of way. We have ideas of citizenship that they didn't have back then. And the French were more concerned, I think, with the commercial aspects of it rather than the political aspects. They didn't realize that at some point the English were going to get half a continent out of this whole thing, the Hudson Bay Company properties. If they did, I think Radisson would have been pursued more than he was.
And getting to that point then, how did Radisson and Groseilliers use their influence, or whatever prestige they were able to accumulate there, to really start the ball rolling for the creation of the Hudson's Bay Company?
I think, well, one thing that Radisson could do was learn languages. So he learned English really quickly. Within a few months, he's able to write in English in a way that is understandable to me anyway. And he gets the ball rolling by being with Rupert during the plague. So Rupert and Radisson are actually at Windsor during the plague. And Rupert becomes totally sold on the Hudson Bay idea. Radisson was also a collector of maps. He owned several big atlases, and any new map that came out, he got his hands on, he bought. So we've got to think that part of his luggage was carting maps around. And just spreading out a map on a table and saying, here's where the furs are. They're between Lake Superior and Hudson Bay. That's where the Cree live, and they've got lots of really good furs. And so if we could just sail there, and the English had sailed to Hudson Bay, but they'd never spent any time along the shore actually meeting the people who lived there. So he said, if we can sail there the way we have before and just set up posts on the coast, we don't have to go inland. We don't have to hire people to cart all this junk to trade. We don't have to get these First Nations on side. All we have to do is just sit there and people will come to us. And that's a pretty good plan. And all of these other people that worked on the Hudson Bay Company had their fingers in little pies in Africa and India and stuff. So this idea of setting up a trading company was nothing new. And they knew that if it worked, they could make a lot of money. But if it didn't work, they'd lose a ship and a bunch of poor sailors would get drowned and there'd be no furs. The buy-in was £300, which is not a lot of money to somebody like Rupert. It's a lot of money to most people of the time, but to the really rich people of the period, that would probably be about, say, $500,000 in our money. So you buy in with that amount, and the Hudson Bay Company ended up paying dividends equal to the original buy-in several years in its early history. So the people got their entire investment back and were still shareholders who could get their entire investment back again and again and again. So if the whole thing went south in 10 years, if the French came in there, if the natives turned on them or whatever, they would have still made all of their money. If the ships didn't come back, which was a really good chance that the ships were going to be wrecked, they were fine. The Hudson Bay Company had no overhead, had no offices, had no employees, and the way they did business is something I talk about in my book. They sit around in coffee shops the way people do in Starbucks now with laptops, and they just work out these deals. They throw their money in, they give it to a manager who puts the whole thing together, and a year later they find out whether or not their ship has literally come in.
And in 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company is granted a royal charter, but neither Radisson or Groseilliers get stock or options. Now, given this whole thing was their idea, how did they get screwed out of that kind of very pivotal moment?
They really needed a better lawyer. We don't get lawyers on the scene until much later in the story, and when we do, things start to turn around a bit for Radisson. It was a dirty deal. They were basically put on as paid labor with no job security and no interest in the company. And this is where Radisson's own thinking starts to fall down. Radisson doesn't realize that not only is he taking people there, but he's training people to be able to do this. So when they sail into Hudson Bay, they now know the way. When they build a fort, they now have a fort. When they start dealing with the Cree are meeting the English. Some of the English people are picking up some Cree words. The Cree are probably picking up some English words. And eventually they can start to make this trip without Radisson. And he just becomes an expense. And at this point in history, there's not a lot of corporate gratitude here. And Radisson is a peasant, and it's all aristocratic investors. And he doesn't realize that even though they like him and they listen to him, that they don't really care about him very much.
Without Radisson and Groseilliers, does the Hudson's Bay Company exist? Or if we speculate how things might play out differently, how vital were they to that idea coming forward? I mean, are we saying they don't get the credit they deserve in the founding of the company? How strong is that claim?
I think it's a really strong claim that they founded it, especially Radisson. I don't think Groseilliers would have. There's no way Groseilliers would have gone to England by himself. The company probably wouldn't have sprung up in England. The idea of that company probably wouldn't have flown because they had all kinds of other investments along the North American coast, especially in what's now the United States. And they had access to furs down there. The French had an inclination to go up there. The Jesuits have been trying to figure out the canoe routes for quite a while to get up to Hudson Bay, and it's actually a Jesuit who makes that trip first. And it's around the time Radisson goes up there. So I think if Radisson had developed the Hudson Bay Company, that the French would have developed trade routes out of Quebec City to Hudson Bay. And those are routes that go from Lac Saint-Jean over the height of land down into Hudson Bay through territory that was quite safe for traveling. So Quebec City would have become a much greater fur trade center than it was.
And as we have listeners around the world, well, in Canada, we're kind of familiar with the Hudson's Bay Company, now known as the Bay, and the role they've played. But can you encapsulate it very briefly into kind of what happens next with the Hudson's Bay Company and the evolution eventually of Canada?
Yeah, because it's not a company like we think of as, it's not like the Coca-Cola company. It's not like the General Motors company, because when they get their charter, when they're incorporated by Charles II, he gives them every part of North America that is in a valley of a river drained by Hudson Bay. Now, you think, well, what's that? And what it is it's almost all of Western Canada from the Rockies to Hudson Bay. It's North Dakota. It's parts of Montana. It's everything that's not part of the Mississippi watershed or the Great Lakes watershed or past the height of land of the Rockies. So we're talking about all of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec is claimed by the English by this charter. This company is in two businesses. Well, one is the fur hat business, which is almost a ridiculous business. And these furs aren't being used to make coats and things. They're being used to make the felt for those big floppy Three Musketeers style hats. And on its own, it would have quietly passed away in the 1800s when people started wearing top hats, which weren't made out of beaver felt. But it also owned this huge chunk of North America, one of the biggest land holdings that anybody has ever owned. And because the government of Canada was able to acquire this property, Canada had a claim to the Great Plains north of the 49th parallel. Had the Hudson Bay Company not been formed, Canada would have had no more claim to that than anyone else. Almost certainly, I think, Canada would only exist as Southern Ontario and Quebec. And Americans would have moved, once they had started settling the plains, would have just moved north and taken all of the agricultural lands of the Great Plains. So basically Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. The Hudson Bay Company's ownership had this European legal foundation. It was something that people actually believed in, even though Charles II had no right to give that land away to anybody. It wasn't English land. They had never seen it. There were all kinds of people living on it.
Well, the indigenous cultures
Well,
all over.
the indigenous people lived on it. If it belonged to anybody, it belonged to them. They believed it belonged to them. But when it came time to adjudicate, and I'm using air quotes here, legal ownership, people in the 19th century didn't take indigenous ownership seriously and believed that the Hudson Bay Company had a real claim. And so when the line was drawn for the border between Canada and the United States, from the Great Lakes to the Rockies, there was this agreement that the Hudson Bay lands were British, and so the 49th parallel line was drawn to the Rockies.
It's incredible. So impactful on Canada we know today, Canada and the U.S. obviously.
It's fluke upon weird twist upon fluke. There are times when the French almost grab Hudson Bay. There are times when the British don't care anymore, but this whole thing survives. And the really odd thing, of course, is that the land changed hands around the time of Canadian Confederation, which is just after the American Civil War. Right when the Americans are expanding into the West, we managed to snatch this piece of property. And the Hudson Bay Company survives and morphs into a department store chain, which is now owned by a hedge fund that also owns Saks Fifth Avenue. So Hudson Bay Company, Saks Fifth Avenue are the descendants of Radisson's work and this fur trade where people were trading copper pots and blankets for lint from beaver pelts, because that's what they wanted, was the lint to make felt. It's an odd little world we live in.
To put a bow on Radisson's life, then he kind of misses out on the Hudson's Bay Company and the windfall from that. But he does continue on with more adventures and exploration in his final years, almost right up to the end.
He defects back to the French. He goes on an expedition to the Caribbean with an Admiral d'Estrées, who runs an entire French fleet onto a bunch of rocks off the coast of Venezuela, along with dozens of pirate vessels that are allied with him. And so Radisson ends up on a coral reef with a bunch of pirates. Now, this for most of us would be a real problem, but Radisson has probably no qualms about eating pirate anyway if he has to. But the pirates, and likely Radisson, are robbing the ships that are stranded of their food while the French sailors starve. So Radisson doesn't have any complaints about what happens to him there, except that he had all his cash on one of the ships, and it's gone. Then he goes back to Hudson Bay, and he does all kinds of stuff that involves betraying French people, betraying English people, and then events catch up to him. He takes the wrong side in English politics, and he ends up sidelined and really spat out by the British political system. But he spends the rest of his life in London, and even that part of his life is quite interesting because he's always in pursuit of the Hudson Bay Company, saying, "You owe me my pension. You owe me a bunch of furs that I stole on your behalf. Will you hire me to be a night watchman?" And he ends up living in a part of London that is now where the London School of Economics is. He's buried in London. He becomes a real sort of British man, or Englishman, I suppose. It's still England, and it leaves behind this incredible legacy and a whole pile of written material, which sets him apart from everybody of his age, of his class, of his background. There's so very little written by people who aren't Catholic priests. French people in North America left almost nothing behind in terms of describing their lives, but Radisson did. We don't know that much about his love life, but I think he kept fairly busy. He only, in his writings, he only talks about it once, where someone tries to seduce him. Like I said, he eloped with the daughter of a pirate, but he was married 4 times, and judging by the sort of rules and laws of the time, he must have been a widower 3 times because divorce was extremely rare. There's no record of him being divorced. There's also no record of him being a bigamist, and his first wife's family certainly would have tracked him down for that. He left a lot of descendants in North America among the indigenous people. There are claims by very large families living in the upper Great Lakes that they're descendants of Radisson, and those are very believable claims. So he likely had kids all over the place. but we don't have any descendants of him. But Groseilliers, his brother-in-law, left all kinds of descendants in Quebec. One of these days I'm going to sit down and see if I'm a descendant of Groseilliers, because thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who have some French ancestry, some Quebecois ancestry like I do, are descended from Groseilliers. Lots of kids who had lots of kids who had lots of kids. That's the one part. I wish I knew more about his love life. I do write about his first wife in England and how he tried so hard to take her with him when he went to France in his second defection, and how much power her father had over her, and how he snuck back, and she must have loved him a lot because she was giving him jewelry and stuff to sell to survive in London while he tried to take her away with him. But that never happened, and it was kind of a sad part of the story.
It is an absolutely compelling book and an incredible story of, I don't know if I would say a life well lived in the traditional sense.
It's a life lived.
It's a life lived.
It's a lot better than looking at the back end of an ox as you till your field for years and years and years. And that's what most people did. In fact, almost everybody. We're talking about, like, he's part of the 1% of people who aren't tied to the land, who are tied to a blacksmith's forge or something like that. He's so wonderfully everywhere, and that's what I like about him, is that he's everywhere, and he's got his eyes wide open, and he really appreciates the fact that he's alive. I think that comes through clearly in the book.
The book is Bushrunner, The Adventures of Pierre, Esprit Radisson, available anywhere you get your fine books. Mark, is there any place where our listeners can follow your exploits to see what other topics you may be working on next?
I have a blog called fairpress.ca, which is a blog where I talk about media, because that's my area of expertise. I talk about media and law. So I don't really talk much about 17th century history. And I'm on Twitter under my own name, Mark Bourrie, and on Facebook under my own name. And so if anybody wants to ask me about the book, I'd be more than glad to talk about it with them on one of the social media sites. And I hope to do some touring with the book, and so that might pop up. I'm fairly easy to find.
Well, we appreciate you being easy to find today, making your way in to speak to us. Thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Well, thank you.
A big thank you to Mark Bourrie for joining us to talk about his new book. As always, thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our awesome audio editor, and to Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Information about all our tours can be found on our website, hauntedwalk.com, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. Be sure to subscribe and rate the show wherever you're listening to us. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.